Hello, everyone, for tuning in on Zoom today, and welcome back to Rebels Off the Hill political panel. I'm Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'm joined tonight by my regular co-host, Robin Brown.
Hello, Libby. Hello, everybody. I am coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Well, thanks very much, Robin. Well, there are many issues facing women and gender diverse people in Canada and around the world. The gender wage gap, war raging on in Gaza and Ukraine, increased femicide, the attack on reproductive health, the specter of a Trump presidency, calls for justice for missing, murdered, and Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples, misleading and dangerous narratives about trans people from elected officials, and more, unfortunately. So today on Off the Hill, we're going to ask, do elected officials and decision makers really want to discuss any of these issues? Or do they simply want to blandly #inspire the female and gender diverse workforce without any real expectation of change? So today we are joined by feminist entrepreneur PK Much and Professor Nadia Abu-Zahra. Unfortunately, Rabble columnist Charlotte Dalwood, who was to join us tonight, is unable to join us due to a last-minute medical situation. So Charlotte, we wish you all the best and hope you have a very good recovery. But thank you so much to PK and Nadia for joining us. Also, welcome to all of you who are on Zoom. We're very happy that you're here tonight to be part of our discussion, and we encourage you to participate in the chat and the polls that might come up, and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function that you'll see on Zoom here. And of course, as usual, we'll do our very best to address the questions that you have and get into the discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to get us started.
Thank you, Libby. There we go. Hello there, PK. And I'm going to invite Nadia also to join us. Hello. Excellent. Well, we begin with a general opener for both of our panelists. Faced with critical issues such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, genocide against whole populations, disproportionately affecting women and children, such as we are witnessing now in Palestine, loss of reproductive rights and false narratives about trans rights, what should we be demanding of the Canadian government and Parliament? Let's start with you, Nadia, and then we'll go to PK.
Well, I think what we should be demanding is all the rights you listed. I think those are so important, and I think we take them for granted as if everyone has them. Not everyone has them, and that's so amply clear when people are having cesarean sections without anesthetics, when people are giving birth to stillborn at an increased rate, chiefly because a war of genocide is being waged against them. So we don't have all of these rights, and I think the first ask is to ensure that people do have equal opportunities to have to be alive, to have an enjoyment in life, and to have the bare minimum, the basics, to be able to survive. And we can do so much more than we're doing at the moment. And this will come up again and again in our discussions today, but we can't start from a colonial position. We can't begin by saying colonialism is okay here, therefore it might be okay somewhere else. Therefore, how can we help with women and girls and, Two-Spirit people and trans people and so on? I don't think that's where we can start. We have to start by saying colonialism has never been okay. And if, 2024 is a bit late in saying that, but better late than never.
Thanks, PK.
Yeah, I love what I love what you said, Nadia. Echo here, except I would add to colonialism has never been okay, that capitalism has never been okay either. And it depends on exploitation of certain folks, certain groups, any group it can get its hands on. And I think that's part of why we aren't getting the movement we need in these spaces. I mean, we all remember, as 2015 when Justin Trudeau stood up and said, I'm a feminist. And, I have to say that, since then, the Liberal government has made a significant amount of investments in the women's foreign policy area, in women's entrepreneurship, and a number of other initiatives. So, have they worked? Not entirely, because you can't, it's a little bit like chipping away at one side of the block without looking at the rest of it. You can't overhaul or change society by just kind of tweaking a part here and there. You have to look at the larger systems. And we haven't seen a lot of change in how capitalism works in Canada. So without some shifts on that front, I don't see how we're ever going to see shifts on anti-Black racism, on the struggle for economic equity, and all of the things that you already mentioned, Nadia. So yeah, so that's what I kind of see is one of the things standing in the way.
Yeah. And Robin, I'm going to jump in here as well, knowing that Charlotte could not join us tonight. So I'm going to add some commentary as well to the questions that you raised. So I hope people will be okay with that. But, the question that you put to us is, what should we be demanding of the Canadian government and Parliament? And I think, this is a very important question, because for me, it's about accountability. When you look at the question that you asked and the issues that you raised, reproductive rights, genocide, missing and murdered women. I mean, these are all issues, and many other issues, where there actually positions have been taken. And in fact, there are laws in place that protect the rights that we have, right? Sometimes there are policies that have evolved over the decades, but in many cases, especially for reproductive rights, or you think about international law on genocide that Canada is a signatory to, you think of the Royal Commission on the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. When you think of trans rights, I mean, these are all rights that, quote, we have won. They're rarely given. They're usually won through a monumental struggle that can take anywhere from decades to hundreds of years. But what I've learned, I was a member of Parliament for 18 years, so it was sort of like, in the belly of the beast, so to speak. And what I learned is that when things are written in policy or even in legislation, it's not enough. That the accountability part, the follow-up part, the holding to account part is equally, if not more important than, the law itself. And I've encountered many people over the years who would say, wow, that was great. We won that. And yeah, these were hard fought victories for women, for gender diverse people. And they're still ongoing struggles. But I've always felt that there's absolutely no way that we can kind of rest on our laurels, right? These are ongoing struggles, and each of these issues require vigilance to protect the rights that have been won. If you look at the question of Canada's foreign policy on Palestine, if you look at the actual policy of the Canadian government, it's actually not that bad. It's just that they don't ever adhere to it. It was even the same under Stephen Harper. He didn't actually change the foreign policy on what's now called Global Affairs website. It remained the same, amazingly. But of course, they completely turned a blind eye to it. So I do think this question, in terms of what should we be demanding of the government and Parliament, it is very much about unfortunately, remaining vigilant. And there's a difference between the government and Parliament. I mean, the government is the government, they have the majority, but Parliament as a whole is also an institution that is accountable. And it does have various mechanisms for accountability, for example, on the environment, on ethics. I mean, there are commissioners who are meant to help provide that accountability. But on the issues that you've raised, Robin, there is no internal kind of parliamentary mechanism that I can think of that automatically produces a process for accountability and sort of that vigilance. So this means that, whether it's the women's movement, the trans movement, the anti-racism movement, these are all things that we actually have to take up and not just sort of say, well, now it's the government's responsibility. It surely is, but it won't happen unless we actually keep forcing it to happen. So I just kind of wanted to add that perspective. And just one other point. I mean, PK, you noted, sort of the colonial position. Oh no, you both did. Nadia, you did too. And I mean, the weird irony is that yes, we live in a democracy, a liberal democracy, but the most colonial institution is Parliament itself. The traditions, the practices, it's all vested in a horrible, British imperialist, colonialist history, right? So even unpacking that and undoing that to bring about change. So believe me, it's not only a struggle externally, it's a struggle internally. And you can talk to pretty well any progressive woman member of parliament, and they'll tell you about what that struggle is like to kind of reform the institution from the inside as well.
No.
Well,
go ahead,
is there
PK.
an order to this, or can I just jump in?
Jump right in. Jump right in.
Maybe you have me like fired up. I'm sure Nadia's fired up now too. So, okay, it took me a minute to warm up. So I want to kind of build on what you just said. And, what can government do was kind of the question, what should change, et cetera. And the policies are there and the laws are there, but change doesn't necessarily happen. And a good example is the trans rights discussion or trans rights issue, because the law is pretty clear. The Canadian Human Rights Act says that gender identity and expression, hate is prohibited and grounds for discrimination and all of those things. The law is there, but we still have people showing up at libraries being anti-trans, and we have people, in other provinces being anti-trans. So I want to bring it to this. I'm wondering if we have an over-reliance on government to make the change. I mean, after all, aren't governments supposed to be, and I know this is not always the case, but, representative of the people. But I feel like we have left it to the laws and the government without actually doing the kind of action we need to have on the streets and in communities. So here's a quick example. Someone flies a offensive flag in a neighborhood, and the rest of the neighborhood looks away. Nobody does anything about it because they don't want to upset the neighbor and so on. And I feel like we've forgotten how to be true citizens and fight for what we believe in. Instead, we leave that to someone else. So I think that calling on government to change is one angle, but I also think we have to change.
Yep. Nadia, did you want to add anything to the discussion on that?
I do. My answer will always be yes.
Good.
I want to go back to this notion of accountability, both what you were saying, Libby, and also PK, how you were saying this needs to move, to be widespread. I think there is an enormous role for accountability to be part of our education system.
Mm-hmm.
I think that instead of, this is what you get on an exam or the quiz at the end of your grade 6, term or whatever, because we have this culture of examinations going down to childhood and up into adulthood. And then, of course, you get in the work world, no one gives you an exam. I mean, if they do, I'd be very surprised. I'd be very curious as to what work environment issues examinations to their employees. And so, or their clients that... And so instead of, this culture of examination and this culture of transmission, you must have knowledge transmitted to you or from you. What if we relied instead on notions of accountability through the education system, and we built up a culture of accountability? And, please don't take this as my original idea. There are entire books written on this by Anishinaabe writers, Nehiyaw writers, entire histories are built on the notion of relational accountability, and entire futures are being constructed that are beautiful and remarkable, that are being generally, I think, ignored, relatively speaking. And if we would bring that into not only our education systems, but the way we try to be in everything that we do, then maybe we would be more collective in our demands for accountability and would not allow things to pass that essentially are mass murder, individual murder. We're talking about femicide. We're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. These are really important issues that if accountability were there, as you both said, maybe, we can move on these issues and prevent these kinds of things from happening and hold accountable those who perpetrate these kinds of things. That's on accountability. But I like, again, what you said, Pico, about collectivity. We need to move as collectives. We're not practiced in that. I don't think we're practiced in that. Again, our education systems, especially, I come from post-secondary, especially post-secondary, are individualizing. And, we're taught to work together when we're 4 and 5. By the time we're 24, we're competitors. And wouldn't it be great if we worked as collectives, if we practiced? And it's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, after you get past 3 people, it can get difficult, but it is important. And we can move mountains if we work collectively, especially in holding people and holding ourselves and one another accountable.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that on this question of accountability, because, I think we look at accountability as some kind of informal, like it's just going to happen, it's spontaneous, but it isn't. You actually have to write it in. You have to build it into whatever change is taking place. So there are some examples now where, like, if a law is passed around equality rights or something like that, that part of the legislative process is including a process of accountability that empowers not just the government, but the people who are part of that transformation to provide the accountability. And I there's this one thing that always sticks out in my head. When I first got elected, it was just at the conclusion of the Royal Commission at the time it was called Aboriginal Peoples. It was a massive Royal Commission. And I always remember this one I read the report, and there was this one recommendation that it was very concrete. It said to train and hire 10,000 healthcare providers in Indigenous communities who were Indigenous. It just happened to stick in my head. And of course, nothing ever happened. I mean, maybe there's, a couple of thousand more, but because there was no process of follow-up or accountability, and it was the same with the missing and murdered women in BC, we had a separate inquiry. And I argued strenuously that accountability had to be part of the report. And for the federal report, they did include that. But even so, there weren't mechanisms that could empower the community, because, you can't just do it, off the side of your desk and say, well, I'm a great volunteer and, well, I'll just add that on my list now, right? I mean, this has to be resourced. It has to be mandated. And so I do think it's part of our sort of democratic process that is, Nadia, you've made this point, it's totally underlooked. It's totally overlooked, that we kind of miss the boat when it comes to, well, how do we get people the resources and the way to actually hold that accountability, right? Make it very visible. So I think it's a very good identification in the discussion that we're having this evening.
No, this is a great discussion. I'm going to go to a question for PK in a second, although I also want to actually mention something related to accountability and just generally to our discussion. So I run a Black activist group, and we see that there's Black people who are supporting the system. So it's the same thing. Let us not paint all women with the same brush. Right? In fact, we've discovered that there's a police board in the Toronto area that has a Black woman on it who is voting for big police budget increases and against accountability measures. So that's what we're talking about here, right? So, but PK, in a Rabble article you wrote on Toronto's March 7th International Women's Day's march that drew thousands of people, you said the central to this year's rally was the ongoing Palestinian genocide. In particular, how the media has underreported that over 70% of the people massacred in Palestine so far were women and children. As a former magazine publisher, do you think that the mainstream media is advancing or hindering progress on gender issues? We'll start with you, and then Nadia, you can certainly jump in. Libby too.
yeah, one of the great things about International Women's Day and the coalition of organizers that puts that on for the last 50 or so years is that they every year pick a theme. And last year it was the Iranian women's struggle. So the theme was women liberation and freedom. And then this year it was focused on the Palestinian women and how they were experiencing the war in Gaza. And there were several speakers and that really talked about this, and it was really well done. But I'm going to switch over to the media side of this. And as a magazine publisher, I did a little bit of work on this, and this is not a scientific study, okay? But what I started to notice was that not only does media not cover, especially mainstream media, not cover what's happening with women in Palestine and in Israel, is they're taking a very particular sort of ideal victim approach. So let me tell you what I mean. When you look at, if you do this Google search yourself on images and news stories on Palestine, the war in Gaza, and particularly women, if you look at North American media, you get a lot of pictures like this. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but you get women mourning, women holding babies, women mourning. Again, a lot of mourning happening. And these are the, whether it's New York Times or The Guardian or HuffPost, these are the images these are the stories that are being told about the poor women of Gaza and, the maternity deaths and malnutrition of pregnant mothers and all pregnant mothers and all of that stuff. But what's not being told is the strength of Palestinian women and their ability to organize and kind of lead. There's stuff happening. And I wanted to harken back to a study that actually was done in, believe it or not, 2011 by the American University in Cairo, Egypt, on Palestinian women, the Western press, and the first intifada. And one of those things this study noted, and this is not that long ago, noted that there was a striking, and I'm going to quote here, a striking portrayal of positively unseen in previous Palestinian struggles for autonomy, women marching defiantly through the plumes of choking smoke, Palestinian women in many cases portrayed as their male counterparts, as sort of having a role in liberation or a role in the war, etc. And so on. And there were lots of groups and organizations and so on. And we're not seeing that. Instead, and the pictures from that, from actually non-Western media, so I checked to see what was happening there, is you do find more images of Palestinian women organizing and taking agency and sort of, working for change in addition to caring for their families and other kinds of things. So I wondered about that and what the impact of that might be. So just wanting to say that there's this kind of using women as the ideal victim, as a way of garnering sympathy, but we also want to tell the other story of women with strength and agency in these spaces. And that is almost completely missing. And when I looked at Canadian mainstream media, again, this was not scientific, but if you do the Google search yourself, what I found really striking was there were more white women that came up in stories about Palestine and women than actually than other women, than racialized women or Palestinian women. So I'm wondering what's going on in the news coverage. And I would say that as a magazine publisher and as a feminist publisher, I would be publishing these stories, not just the stories of the tragedies, as important as they are.
Thank you, Nadia.
You took the words out of my mouth. The first moment you asked that question, I was thinking of this doctor who ran, through all sorts of kind of, missiles and bullets and fire and explosions in the night. And she's running, she's crouched and she's running. And then she's referred to in all this media as a nurse, and people correcting, unfortunately, medicine can be hierarchical rather than recognizing that, nurses actually do important roles, but there's this notion that women are nurses, men are doctors, and so on. So everyone referred to her as the Palestinian nurse. And people had to write in and say, no, sorry, she, if she were a nurse, that would be wonderful, but she happens to be a doctor. And so I do think that what is missing is the resilience. And it's very difficult to be faced with this massive stereotype that resistance goes along with the word military. Palestine doesn't have a military. Resistance is to survive. Resistance is resilience. And this is in the writing of Anishinaabe writer Leanne Betesimosaki Simpson, where she writes, "Why are you telling us we didn't resist? We are alive after centuries. That is resistance." And we are practicing, and we are, healthy and with good ties and good relations. And that is resistance. And it's the same for it's the same for Iraqi women and Libyan women and Palestinian women. And these are places that I can speak to more easily, but it's also the same with Rohingya women and Uyghur women. It'll be the same the world around. And yet, nevertheless, when it comes to women, we're not portrayed in the media as the people who are the change makers and the people who are the survivors, who make things happen, who keep people alive. And it's more of a headline to kill someone than to keep them alive. I think it should be more of a headline that we keep them alive and, and wanting to be alive. I've seen women bring people back from not wanting to be alive to wanting to be alive. That's the greatest miracle I've ever seen in front of my eyes.
Just to quickly add to that, Robin, it's a great discussion, and it's sort of causing me to think of other situations too. And not only are those stereotypes really, really strong, but the language as well. I'm thinking of, when women are like literally rising up and fighting hard for their rights, we're often called strident. I've never heard a man called strident. I'm waiting actually for the day to hear a man be called strident. Men who are in a struggle and for whatever, it's like they're leaders, they're strong, they're assertive, but women are strident or sometimes hysterical, right? Like it's somehow then down to some sort of emotional debate, right? That we're hysterical, and this plays out not only in public arenas but also in institutions, whether it's education or whether it's parliament. I think of the history of reproductive rights in Canada. Or even the right to vote, for God's sake. Going back, many years. The women who were, you think of the early women who were involved in the right to vote. They were sidelined. They were dismissed as like crazy hysterical people, right? And so I think the language too has to change. I sometimes like to think that on social media some of that is changing. Like we've had Basan Zubi on Off the Hill a couple times, and she's always made the point to us that that she thinks the mainstream media is pretty bad, and I hope, and a little shout out to Rabble here, that Rabble is a sort of an independent progressive media, pays much more attention to these qualities of reporting, right, and how the reporting is done. But I like to think sometimes that in the social media too, it is changing. It can be vitriolic and it can be poisonous. It can be toxic, as we've all known, and it's horrifying. But there's also portrayals that I think that are more realistic and more humanizing about minorities or racialized people. So I always sort of try to fool myself that yes, maybe that is changing a bit. I don't know. It's not scientific either, but one hopes, right? I'm actually going to switch back to co-host now and ask, unless somebody else wanted to jump in on that question, but I wanted to just specifically pose a. Yes, Robin.
Actually, I do want to jump in with one thing about what
Yes.
PK mentioned about this idea of the ideal victim. So again, in terms of the work that we do with the Black community, one of the things that Robin Maynard identified in her work is that in terms of talking about police brutality, the ideal victim in terms of Black folk is actually Black males, and they ignore the experience of Black women. That's one thing. And then in terms of how they report on Black men, we just had an example of this ideal victim thing. We had a young brother who was beaten up by the police in a case of mistaken identity here in Ottawa. And in the CBC story about him, it said, CBC has confirmed that Mr. Neon Dagara does not have a criminal record. And I emailed the reporter, and I'm like, why did you put that in there? And he said, actually, that wasn't me, that was the editors. I'm like, all right. So then I emailed the editors. Of course, they haven't responded. But essentially that's saying he didn't have a criminal record, which means he didn't deserve that kind of treatment. People with criminal record, oh, they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would they have ever said that in a non-racialized person? Like we had a great discussion about whiteness. Was it our last off the hill?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, gosh, the contradictions. Well, I'm going to just move over to Nadia now and focus on a report that you were involved in January of 2021, the Feminist Foreign Policy Working Group, which I know you were a member of, and the group released a report, Be Brave, Be Bold, Recommendations for Canada's Feminist Foreign Policy. And the report had recommendations on issues. It was pretty far-ranging, from demilitarization and disarmament to globalization, trade and investment, to how human rights must guide feminist foreign policy. And so, pretty major report. So first of all, I was wondering, Nadia, if you can explain how you see feminist foreign policy. What is that? And second, what progress has been made on the report's recommendations since 2021? And do you feel that there's more work that is required?
Well, I think it's quite inspiring to look around the world for examples of feminist foreign policy. While it's maybe not in play at the moment, the first one was 10 years ago. This year is the anniversary from Sweden. And it's very inspiring to see how they put that into action for years, and how every embassy was working on that, on how their international relations were defined by that. And it had incredible fruits of labor and set the tone, frankly, for the rest of the world to start saying, oh, maybe we should be thinking about that, including Canada. And one of the most remarkable actions to be taking place at the moment on discussions on what feminist foreign policy would look like, because I won't put forward a definition, but you can see many different ways in which people are putting together their ideas. And I'll talk about those two reports in a moment. Is a new podcast called Effit, exploring feminist and First Nations approaches to foreign policy. And this is hosted by Julie Balangari and is informing Australian feminist foreign policy, or future feminist foreign policy, we hope. And this is a place to be thinking about for the future. This is a direction that I think has been underexplored and is really important to be thinking about for the future, and is a fantastic example for, I'm situated on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, for us to be thinking about in places like the place I'm situated in at the moment. I think, how close are we to that in our current way we vote in the United Nations, the way we choose to join or not join military aggressive forces, the way we choose to stand up for principles that as you said, on paper we have, but in practice perhaps less so. There's an enormous disparity. And I think that that's an enormous impediment. Canada has been thinking about releasing a feminist foreign policy, a written document for quite some time. We were, we were asking around and initiating discussions and social media kind of soliciting of ideas and this enormous idea gathering. And we're talking about 2021. These are now years ago, and yet without something yet to see. And of course, with rumblings of, well, how long will there be for this to be possible? And meanwhile, actions taken that go very contrary to principles of human rights, of disarmament, of reproductive health, of justice, essentially, and our own conceptions of justice, not only universal conceptions, but our own conceptions of justice, are that can undermine, how can we stand up and on the one hand say, we have a policy based in human rights, and on the other hand say, but only for some people. That's going to be our dilemma of the future. But dilemma or no dilemma, we still must say, and this is what I say, we still must say, human rights must be at the center. Social justice must be at the center. We cannot live a future where people are dying on the streets for lack of shelter. We cannot live a future where, mass starvation is initiated by a military, as we see. So I hope that we move forward on this in whatever form it takes at this point. This is a moment of beggars cannot be choosers, that at minimum, we need to set a tone that human rights are important.
Thank you, Nadia.
Go ahead, PK.
I have a quick question for you, Nadia, if that's okay. So the report was written in 2001, which is great, and years have passed. Since then, we've had the Ukraine war. We now have the Palestinian war, and I'm just curious. One of the questions we ask in the feminist movement is where are the peace and feminists? Like, where's the peace feminist movement in Canada? I don't see it. Maybe you do. I was wondering if maybe you see more of it. And if in the world we have today, do you see the peace movement coming back in more full force, given the conversations we're having? And how would that affect feminist foreign policy?
Well, I like to think of peace as an absence of structural violence, not only an absence of resistance, not only an absence of repression of resistance, but, justice, peace where people are hungry, where people are starving, where people are going to die because of lack of medication won't be peace. And so thinking, and I know that's what you mean. I just wanted to clarify. Thinking of peace as an absence of structural violence, as in fact structural justice, we have to work toward that every day. And there are, I think, brilliant groups working toward that where people don't think consciously that these groups work toward. Like, for instance, groups that are against poverty. Homes Not Bombs was the most, and continues to be one of the most extraordinary organizations, because it puts these two things in deep contrast to say we want homes, not bombs. Our budget alone tells volumes about what we think is important. When we buy bombs and not homes, we've made a structural decision as to what we think we want to invest in the future. When we buy drones and not food, and when we buy, and so on and so forth. And so we can have a brighter future with not only these organizations, but with a mentality that what we want as a collective is for structural justice rather than structural violence. And so I look broadly at these groups, but I think, for instance, World Beyond War is an extraordinary group doing very important work. Peace Brigades International have just been going steady, consistently for decades. And it's actually inspiring to observe organizations that don't fall. Women's International League of Peace and Freedom has a history that goes back, to black and white, shall we say. And so there are organizations in these movements, but I think part of a feminist foreign policy would be to support these groups, to recognize feminist activists working around the world. And feminist not meaning feminine necessarily, feminist meaning feminist. Feminist as a notion of addressing unequal power dynamics. That encompasses many people around the world. And a policy should explicitly be thinking about how can these voices and these actions and these activities be strengthened? And the grassroots is incredible. To see people building, homes together, to see people doing mutual aid in crises, those I think are the movers and the shakers that are underseen, if that's a word, underseen. The word in other languages than English, but we'll bring it into English. Those are, I think, people who are bringing about a future in the present. And if we can simply expand those, and that has been remarkably done by organizations like the Equality Fund and others that have shown that this is possible.
I just want to add in, Nadia, because I don't know if you're aware, but you mentioned the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who's been around for, well, probably more than 100 years. And there actually is a peace caravan being organized right now by WILPF and other organizations that Jace was just, who's part of the Rabble team here. He and I were just chatting about it before we started. It's actually leaving Vancouver, I think May 12th. Going to Ottawa, and there will be a conference about the very questions that you just raised. So the whole notion, there was the abortion caravan in the 80s. So there was the On to Ottawa trek, the unemployed during the Depression. There was a housing On to Ottawa trek that I was involved in the 90s. So now we actually have a new sort of peace caravan that's going to gather up steam across the country and culminate in, I think, a very strong conference. So I don't know whether anyone's got any information that they could put that in the chat, but it's something to keep your eye on. May the 12th, starting from Vancouver.
If I can also add how deeply inspiring First Nations leaders, and when I say leaders, I remember being introduced to a leader. And I, looked down and was like, well, it's very nice to meet you, because the leader was 10 years old. And I was just so taken aback, and still a leader, obviously. This was years ago. I think that it is important to remember things like peace must include clean water. Peace must include respect and safety and a future for all of the world around us that's not human. These are things that are important. What's peace if in 10 years we don't have clean water? Or what's peace if today so many people are living day to day without clean water? That's not peace, to me. So the activists, what I'm trying to say is the activists who are protecting water sources, who are defending, the resources. I'm sorry to use the word resources. I should use so many other things, who are defending the lands and the waters and our relatives, our non-human relatives. I think those are the peace activists for the future.
So I have a thought just in terms of what came up for me when both of you were talking, and I'll just kind of ask maybe out of curiosity. So what I hear a lot of in this conversation is the intersection of all these movements, right? Like all these pieces and everything else. And at least I noticed there's different groups doing different things, but I have yet to be in an environment where all of these folks come together. There's, whether it's democracy exchange events or this or that, how do we bring all these pieces? Because it's such a complex set of issues that it seems like various groups are kind of going at one piece of it, but how do we sort of bring these groups together? And I wondered if anyone had thoughts about that.
Well, it's actually a good segue into the last question, which is, where's a good place to begin, like for change? And I think you're right, PK, that, historically, movements have operated sort of a bit in silos. similar to governments with, different ministries and policies and so on. And so I think the challenge for us is to work much more strongly in alliances and coalitions. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I can remember the days when the climate justice movement was completely divorced and separate from the anti-poverty movement. In fact, they barely spoke to each other, or the labor movement was completely separate. And I do think that over the years, there's now, now people are much more likely to talk about climate justice and anti-poverty or social justice. They're more inclined to bring them together. But I do think it's a struggle, and we don't open our own doors enough to each other, right? We tend to sort of, we're passionate about a particular issue, and that's great. Go for it, wherever you can. But this need to gather our own strength, right? I think we live in such a cynical world. And so this is addressing the question of where to be. Again, I find that the biggest challenge is that people can feel so disempowered and cynical because of what they're fed by the mainstream media, that you don't have a voice, you don't have a vote, you can't change anything. All politicians are bad. They say it over and over and over again, and we believe it, right? And so we actually give away our power to those who already have it. And so to me, that is the biggest change, is in our own heads, and then bringing that to work with other people, that we do have power, we do have voice, and collectively, when we bring those movements together, well, heck, we can change the world, right? And so we should feel very empowered by that. But it's something you have to work at. You really have to work at it and be conscious of it, because I don't think it happens spontaneously. It has to be a conscious way of working with each other and recognizing there's burnout, recognizing that people get tired and you need to refresh, you need to bring new people in, especially young people, new voices. But the goal is to make it much more holistic. So to me, that's a very important part of where to begin with change.
All right, great discussion. We're going to move on to some audience questions now. It's before we close, and we have one for you, Nadia. It is, can Nadia give examples of what education-based accountability might look like?
I can. Thank you for the question. I ask in my classes that people do something that has two criteria. Well, three, I suppose, but I'll talk about that. One is that it has to be collective. It doesn't mean they have to work in a group with everyone else in the class. I mean, they can work with whomever they like outside the class, but in some way, shape, or form, it has to be collective. It's not a sole project for a sole person. The other thing is that it has to be something that they're connected to, that actually the connection to them is more important than the connection to the title of the course. It has to be something that they really understand. And the third criterion is the relational accountability. And so the collective, that's where the relational accountability comes in, as well as the fact that it's connected to them. So let me give some examples. So one that comes to mind very quickly was a student who came and said, I'd like to work on supporting people with addictions. And I was worried because, the student wasn't saying that the student had an addiction. This student wasn't saying this was the student's community. And I thought, well, I've got to ask the question, is this your community? And the student said, well, one of my parents died 3 years ago of an overdose. This is my community. I was like, you go. And from that point on, the student developed something called the Solidarity Alliance for People Who Use Drugs. You can look them up, SAPWUD, and did absolutely remarkable work and continued to be accountable to the people who were volunteering, to the people who were taking part, to the people who were involved in any way with this new collective that the student was creating among others. And so I don't ask, how many statistics have you memorized, or, I don't ask questions on the notions of knowledge in that sense, but I ask, can you please write up how you maintain accountability in this context? How do you continue to be accountable in this context? It's not an easy question. It sounds easy, but it's actually really difficult. And over, students have amazed me with the work that they do. One student came in, parent of 4 children, the 4th child born with spina bifida. This parent wanted to write about daycares that would discriminate against the child and therefore create challenges for the entire family, not least the child, but for the entire family. And the day that student presented at the end of term, the class sort of roared with appreciation and respect for this parent who would fight for the rights of their child and who would change structures to do so. And so that's the accountability that's constant in all of these initiatives. And I can't teach that, but I can provide written works that talk about it. I can talk about it from a personal perspective. I can encourage everyone in the class to do so. And meanwhile, honestly, it's these students who are teaching everyone else how to be accountable. And that's, these are adults. These are people who range in age from, 17 to 67. But I think that this might be something we could do all throughout education. Thank you very much for the question. Let me know if I haven't answered it enough.
Excellent. Thank you. I know you've done a great job. And now we have a question for you, PK. Right here. It is, PK, where can people find out where can people find out about things like the caravan or the International Women's Day rally in Toronto?
Okay. So the caravan, I noticed someone put the link, or Libby or someone or Rabble put the link in the chat. So just have a look at, if you're talking about the peace caravan, which is what I'm assuming. As far as the IWD Day in Toronto, I will put a link in the chat as well. It's a volunteer coalition, so you're not going to find it as a very flashy sort of organization. They have a website. You can volunteer to engage with them as a person or as an organization as well. But you would want to get in touch with them at around January of each year, so a couple of months in advance. So I'll put the link in the chat and then follow them there. They also do have a Facebook page, but I don't know who's on Facebook anymore. So so you may just want to keep note of the link and keep in touch with the organizers of the year. So
Excellent.
I'll put that in the chat.
We're getting near the end. So I think we have time for you guys to answer this one last audience question, which is on the themes of a couple of themes. So what do you think of this year's International Women's Day theme, which was Inspire Inclusion, versus the UN's theme, which is Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress?
Oh, okay. You want me to start?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just going to come out and say it because I actually wrote about it. It is the corporatization of International Women's Day is just, I don't know what to say about it. It's sad. It's just sad. And, campaigns that say inclusion, accelerate inclusion or this or that, that's a DEI slogan. That's not an International Women's Day slogan, an event that started a revolution, a long time ago in Russia. Like this is an event to celebrate women's struggle and their ability to organize and fight back and do all of those things. So nothing against diversity and inclusion, of course. Yes, bring it on. But as a slogan for International Women's Day, just saying.
Mm-hmm. I think what happens, Robin, is to that question. I think we see it at pride parades. Like that began as a struggle for gay liberation, and then suddenly the Royal Bank shows up, with their pride parade, and so things become, first of all, they become institutionalized, and then they become corporatized because, like banks or whatever, they suddenly realize, oh, we can get through to a whole new level of our customers here, right? And so they become quite good at it. And you know, there are federal laws on employment equity, as there should be, you know, and they're mandated in all federal departments, and that's all as it should be. But International Women's Day is, I think, you know, historically about a global movement. And, you know, you think about the women who died in the fire in New York City, the garment workers, right? That also began International Women's Day. So I think one has to be mindful of the original kind of impetus and principles of what started a movement, and try and live up to that. It will evolve, but we also can, you know, we can make it participatory, we can make it bold, we can make it something that people feel excited about. But if we, you know, if we just institutionalize it, it sort of gets boring, and it just becomes a government initiative. And I think maybe that's the problem here. We got to take it back, right?
Yeah.
And make it about a movement for change, transformative change, right? That people can feel inspired by.
Yeah, and that people can speak their truth at. So one of the, I got to give IWD Toronto just one more shout out, because they have they have prevented corporatization. It's voluntary. You will not see any corporate folks at the march. You will not see any corporate funding or floats or signs. You'll see the Marxists and the communists and the, you know, the ECE folks and the unions and all the other folks. But yeah, I think they've done a terrific job of avoiding that, and more power to them to continue that.
Yep.
Excellent. That's a great note to end on, because that's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you to our wonderful guests, Nadia and PK, for joining us today. Our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return next month. As a reminder, we now have a regular day set for the series. You can join us for Off the Hill every third Wednesday of the month, every month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen April 17th. So be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, a big thank you, as always, to Rabble for hosting events like this. To keep events like this going, please consider supporting Rabble by making a one-time donation, or even better, becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. So thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and we will see you next month on April 17th.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.